So hello, welcome everybody to a new video, just a quick PowerPoint one, where today I want to talk a little bit about the term Lahai-Roi, especially because we've actually ended up finishing the story, finishing the Lahai-Roi saga in 3.3, and I really just want to do a quick video talking about looking back and thinking what was the main message of the Lahai-Roi story and what did Lahai-Roi as a concept actually end up meaning. So, of course, with the end of the 3.3 story, you saw a lot of great moments when it came to, for example, the Explorer cutscene, the Exostrator's reveal about what its mission was, what it was trying to do, and like saving the people of Lahai-Roi, all that good stuff. But one of the things that we still don't really know about, and I think a lot of people didn't commentate on, sorry, we know about it, but a lot of people didn't commentate on a very important scene about what really Lahai-Roi meant, right? Because at the end of 3.3, at the end of the Lahai-Roi saga, we had a very pivotal scene with the Exostrator, if you guys remember, because the whole thing with the Exostrator was there was a very important cutscene when we banished Aleph 1, where the Exostrator kind of like basically said that, you know, like, it wished to change its designator to Lahai-Roi, right? And it was a really important scene, not just because the Exostrator was trying to really justify and become the god, the savior, the hero of the people of this land, but also it reinforced this kind of idea and reprompted this question about what Lahai-Roi as a concept, as a thing, really means, right? And that's why, of course, we kind of like get to this sort of like thing at the very end where, you know, we as the arbiter of both the Sentinels and the Exostrator have to kind of like, you know, make a decision. You know, of course we're gonna ask and just like tell the Exostrator, of course you can, right? Like the Exostrator did went above and beyond for his duty, and it was one of many Exostrators we know, but it was the one that saved Lahai-Roi as a land, right? And when we ask, for example, you know, like why the Exostrator did all of this, the Exostrator simply says that it wishes to be reminded of their heart's origin. And the heart's origin, of course, is the artificial heart, the imperfect one that the people of Lahai-Roi provided to the Exostrator. But one of the things I think a lot of people aren't talking about, which was something very interestingly we talked about a lot at the beginning of 3.0, was what Lahai-Roi really meant, right? Especially since we finished the story now, and we can actually look back and make this kind of analysis to think about, okay, we guessed a lot about Lahai-Roi at the beginning, but now that we finished, what does it actually mean? Because if you guys remember from the very beginning of 3.0, and really even before 3.0, when Kuro was doing a lot of the teasing for the region of Lahai-Roi, all we really had was a name, right? We only had the name of Lahai-Roi, and Lahai-Roi, as we're going to go through later on, is a very, very particular phrase and name. So we were trying to guess so much about the land and region of Lahai-Roi just from its name alone. And I want to basically revisit that, right? Because this was, I think, on the public consciousness of the community so much at the beginning of 3.0, but even when the Exostrator kind of like deemed and said like it wished to be renamed Lahai-Roi, not a lot of people are talking about what the term now means retrospectively now that we actually finish a story, right? So in case you forgot or you may not even know what Lahai-Roi means, Lahai-Roi is actually a name of a place that appears in a lot of Abrahamic religions. Specifically, it appears in the Bible, right? But it's also attested in some Islamic supplementary material and whatnot. It's really Abrahamic based, right? And Lahai-Roi comes from the Bir Lahai-Roi. Bir basically is the name for a well, which is why the translation for Bir Lahai-Roi is the well of the living one who sees me, or the God who sees me, right? And it's one of the most famous biblical wells because there's quite a lot of wells within the Bible that are all scattered across in the Negev desert, right? And as you can probably imagine, Negev desert, it's a very inhospitable place. So a lot of the wells aren't just kind of like areas where people settle or people find like kind of like, you know, like rejuvenation, but there is an intense symbolism behind it. And we'll talk about that a bit later, but for beer Lahai-Roi, Lahai-Roi is most famous for being the well that was the saving grace of the Egyptian maidservant Hagar, right? And Hagar was basically fleeing from the household of Abraham and Sarah. Abraham is the one, is like kind of like the progenitor of all of the Abrahamic religions like Judaism, like Christianity, like Islam, if you didn't know. And basically, while Hagar was like kind of like running across the desert, so desperate for anything really, she stumbled across a well, right? And it's at this well, and this is just a visual depiction, by the way. It's not actually Lahai-Roi. It's just a random well in the desert. But she stumbles across a well, and at that well, she receives a vision from God, right? And God basically told her to not give up hope, to return to Abraham's household, that she would have a role to play, right? And I won't really kind of like extrapolate into like what exactly a role was. You can read the Bible if you want to know, right? But the thing is, after Hagar received this kind of prophetic experience, she named the well that she saw God as Lahai-Roi, because Lahai-Roi means the God or the living one who sees me, right? The God that has kind of like provided salvation, hope for me, like who was like desperate, right? So that kind of course, basically translates into this idea, right? Where Lahai-Roi is not just basically a well in a desert, but it's a kind of place in a desert that provides hope, provides this divine providence and salvation, where when someone like Hagar is in a desperate situation, they are provided with, as I say here on the screen, divine salvation, hope. I think that's really kind of like one of the major symbolisms of Lahai-Roi, which is something that is only accentuated because it's basically located in the desert, right? And we talked so much about this at the beginning of 3.0 about like what this could mean. Like, is this like a godless land? Is this like, for example, a place where God has touched and seen like the people of Lahai-Roi? And all of these speculations, I would say, like looking back, were kind of half correct, but not in the way that we could have ever possibly imagined, right? So first things first off, we need to of course compare Lahai-Roi, the two versions of Lahai-Roi that we know. We know Beer Lahai-Roi from Abrahamic religions, can't speak, sorry. And then we also have Lahai-Roi within Wuthering Waves, right? And there's two real similarities here. The first one, of course, is in terms of setting, right? Because as we said before, Lahai-Roi is a well in the desert, it's one of the many wells in the Negev desert, and this kind of idea of this inhospitable land, this like kind of like haven of life within it, is really translated into this idea of Lahai-Roi within Wuthering Waves, because it's an ice desert, it's a frost land, right? And Lahai-Roi is kind of like this cradle of humanity within this inhospitable location. And besides that, of course, we also have this idea of this these desperate people, right? Like these desperate people who were seeking guidance and salvation. In the Bible, of course, that was Hagar, right? But within Wuthering Waves, we also have the Royans who were suffering from the lament. And we now know from the 3.3 story that it was the Exorcist Rider that saw their plight and kind of responded to their cries for guidance and salvation in very much the same way that Hagar did in the Bible at Lahai-Roi, right? So, of course, this really folds into this idea of salvation, right? Because we all know that like Lahai-Roi is kind of like an ice desert, and that kind of links to Lahai-Roi, the real Beer Lahai-Roi in a way, but I think the real symbolic message behind this is just salvation, right? And we even have, like, for example, if you're wondering where this kind of scene comes from, where we see the ancient Royans running away from the devastation of the lament, that scene actually comes from a cinematic short that never appears in the game. It was released in 3.1, never appears in the game, and it's called salvation, right? And looking back at basically this cinematic, this was such an important cinematic back when it was released, but now that we have more context about what exactly the Exostrider did, right? What exactly it tried to do, we realize that these visions that Ameth had in the cockpit during that cinematic were actually basically first-person views of the Exostrider looking down on the people of Lahai-Roi. And that is why the cinematic is called Salvation, because what did the Exostrider provide to the people of Lahai-Roi? It provided hope, guidance, and salvation, right? And it's kind of funny in a way, because one of the things that's really important about the Exostrider's role as a savior is that we know that the Exostrider is not a Sentinel. It shares some similarities like material and some program with Sentinels, but its role is entirely different, right? It's meant to be a delivery machine. So you're presented with this kind of dichotomy where the Royans, who of course like don't know too much about the Exostrider's origins, come to realize, and well, like they come to realize the true role of the Exostrider after Passrover tells them, but for all intents and purposes, most Royans worship the Exostrider as a god, right? As a divine figure that saved them, that provided them a kind of like guidance and salvation, while Rover and their homeland civilization just sees them as basically a Sentinel deliveryman, right? So this really interesting kind of dichotomy presents us a sort of like logical fallacy, because the Exostrider was a god that was never meant to be. And what I really mean by that is this idea that the whole concept of Lahai-Roi is preceded with this idea that a divine figure like a god provides guidance and salvation to mortals. But the problem is, the Exostrider was never meant to be a god in the first place, right? If anything, the Exostrider was never meant to be seen by the people of Solaris Free, right? The Sentinels don't even know about the Exostrider, and we know that because Shorekeeper told us. It was never meant to be a god. It has the same benevolent program as Sentinels, it has a lot of similarities, but it was strictly never meant to interfere in Solaris Free. It was meant to just dump Sentinels on the planet and go, right? So it kind of just raises this idea that the only reason the Exostrider, as we know, like the Exostrider, because there's multiple, but we're just going to say the Exostrider, like this good boy over here, right? The only reason this Exostrider became a god was because the people wanted it to be. And we see, for example, in 3.3, when the Exostrider is talking to Rover, right? It was basically trying to kind of like shut itself down, but then it saw a lot of like the Royans, these people who were suffering, and they were kind of like, of course, suffering under the lament, the Frenodian and Void Matter, and it chose to be their savior out of its own volition, right? It follows the protocol shared of the Sentinels, extracted the Maya reactor drive and encased it deep within the ice, then it powered down to slumber. So this idea that we now know all too well, that the Exostrider sacrificed its reactor, its heart, in order to be the sun for Lahai-Roi underground, right? And that's why the Royans see the Exostrider as Baldur, because if you guys don't know who Baldur is the son of Odin. He's one of Odin's sons in Norse mythology, and specifically he's the god of light, right? And that of course makes so much more sense when you see like what the Exostrider provided the Royans was, they literally provided them light and life in extension. And they also sacrificed themselves to stop the terror of Virunga, right? And Virunga is the name that the Royans give to the Frenodian Aleph 1. Virunga being another name within 3 different Norse sources for Loki, right? And if you guys don't know much about Ragnarok, that's okay. But Ragnarok, which is kind of like the Norse conception of the end of the world, begins when Loki tricks someone, or like basically inadvertently kills Baldur, right? And that's why like they had this confrontation. We know from, for example, Ameth's cutscene in 3.1 when she helped like seal Aleph 1, basically it left the Exostrata in a mortal state, right? So from that point onwards, it basically started the chain of Ragnarok. So, of course, this kind of like caused a lot of like stirring in the community, because not only did we realize the Exostrata basically at the very end, like at the very beginning of like the history of Lahai-Roi, basically save the place and save the people, but at the end of 3.3, they also basically banish LF1, right? With a kind of like spear attack, which I think is very heavily obvious, basically just a reference to Gungnir, which is Odin's spear from Norse mythology that never misses. So, of course, that kind of like presents a very interesting theory, because as we said before, the Exostrata was a god that was never meant to be. So they basically, as you can see here, saved the world when it wasn't in his job description, and that's why a lot of people on social media and stuff like that are kind of comparing the Exostrata right now to the Sentinels, because the two Sentinels that we know, like Jiwei was kind of okay, right? But Jiwei was also kind of like stuck in a loop and couldn't do anything, and then Imperator basically killed himself, right? Of course, every day is a day for Imperator slander when it comes to this community, but like, Imperator wasn't useless, I'm not saying that, but like, just for the sake of the meme, you guys know what I'm talking about, right? The Exostrata went above and beyond when it came to fulfilling its role as a de facto god, de facto sentinel, when it was never meant to be their role in the first place. So, of course, this basically brings us back, right, to why did the Exostrata want to be called Lahai-Roi? Because if we ask the Exostrata that, they just say that, oh, I want to be called Lahai-Roi because it reminds me of the place that gave me my heart. But there is something deeper than that, and you can probably imagine from what we've kind of discussed already with this whole idea of not just, for example, Lahai-Roi, but also how the Exostrata is really not a god, right? We need to kind of like break this down a little bit, and that's why I want to talk first off about something that I've noticed a lot within Wuthering Waves' symbolism and how they kind of like craft the messaging and design language of the game, which is that Wuthering Waves tends to have a very humanist rhetoric, right? If you guys don't really know what humanism is, that's okay. Humanism is basically kind of like, sounds very egotistical, but it's basically a kind of like thought process or thought movement that places humanity at the center of importance and things, rather than, for example, religion, a deity, or whatnot, right? And this really aligns with this idea that the key message of Wuthering Waves is basically, as I say here, the eternal spirit of humanity in the face of relentless tragedy, impossibilities, and other designs such as gods, fate, etc., will still persevere regardless of the troubles beset to it, right? And we can see that promoted through so much of the game's messaging. For example, a couple of videos ago, if you guys want to take a watch, I just talked about lighthouses, right? Because lighthouses are such an important piece of symbolic, like, it's just such a important symbolic detail that Kura loves to use all the time, and they've actually used that, continue to use that even after I posted that video, right? But this messaging is very humanist in nature. It's positing that humanity will persevere, right? They will brave the relentless beats of the Wuthering Waves, essentially. And because of this kind of messaging, one thing you're going to find is that Kuro is not shy or adverse at all to using references to religion, right? But when religion is referenced, it's oftentimes kind of really appropriated, or it's kind of twisted, not twisted with like a negative connotation, but twisted to fit a differing kind of perspective, right? The way they're kind of depicted is not really something that I would call like against religion or anti-religious, but it's much more humanist and nuanced, right? And I'll provide some examples. For example, sorry, I just repeated myself. Provide some examples to illustrate what I mean in just a second, but you can see this all over the game, right? Like, for example, one of the first kinds of obvious interactions we have with religious messaging is Leviathan, right? Because Leviathan keeps loving to say that it is a savior, a lord, like it has designs for the civilization of Renacida, But it's really interestingly depicted because even though it almost kind of like presents itself as God, you can look deeper and basically realize that it is actually the devil, right? And when you look at, for example, a lot of the symbolism associated with it, like such as how within its paradise, the journey in paradise, the very beginning of the journey starts with a stone tablet. And the inscription etched on that stone tablet is basically the same inscription from the Gates of Hell within Dante's Inferno, if you've read that, as well as also the fact that we've broken this down like so many times, but Leviathan is like based on Thomas Hobbes, right? And specifically, it's based on Thomas Hobbes's idea of basically despotism, right? This idea that security is the utmost priority and human agency, human freedom should be sacrificed in order to achieve it, right? So it's a very kind of like satirical depiction of Leviathan, and I think that there is possibly a kind of take you can have that is like it's actually going against Christianity or whatnot, but I think it's a bit more nuanced than that, right? I feel like it's almost like, I think some people have said it's like almost like the Antichrist, right? And it's like, it's very deceptive, weaponizing religion. Like Leviathan loves weaponizing the church and religion for its own aims, right? And that of course falls into like the next thing, which is the Order of the Deep, which is kind of like the church that Leviathan tricked into worshipping it. And you can kind of see that even here, this religious references and messaging that Kuro does is very nuanced, right? Because the Order of the Deep, and I kind of broke this down within my brand video, is really inspired by, like, you know, Christianity. And like I talked about, for example, my Phoebe video, that Phoebe has a book that you can actually translate from Raganessi's script. And you can kind of see here, so many of the phrases are basically based on the Bible, right? But at the same time, we know that the Order of the Deep is a corrupt organization. For example, Bran basically serves as this character foil of this kind of like humor who was wronged by the church and presents an alternate path where people are not binded by forced unity, but through a shared humanity. And you don't need really any more evidence of this than, for example, Brand himself, who is based on Sebastian Brandt, who was the author of Das Narrenschiff. Das Narrenschiff being a book that was really trying to use satirical comedy to expose the corruption of the Catholic Church, especially kind of like around the 14th to 16th centuries, right? And you can kind of see that even though a lot of the order is like well-spirited, like they have good intentions, the underlying kind of foundation of it through, like, for example, Fenrico and stuff is rotten, right? And that's why, like, for example, you can see it again, very similar to Leviathan. It's a very nuanced religious depiction. And I think the next one we're going to talk about is basically Galbranna, right? Because Galbranna is the archetypal, basically, devilish character. But as we can probably see from how Galbranna is basically depicted, Galbranna doesn't really adhere to really like strict moral tenets or systems, because even though she is like unquestionably a kind of sinner, she's not depicted as a bad character. And you can kind of see, for example, how a lot of the facts that she has wings, a lot of her powers are from like are gained from evil, because she weaponizes it for good. It's presenting her as not a sinner, but actually a kind of like anti-hero kind of character. I would even say she's beyond an anti-hero, right? And you can kind of say like see that, you know, Galbranna was not a sinner by choice. You can kind of, if you played through a story, if you've watched and read her lore and stuff like that, you will know like she didn't choose to sin, right? It was against her own volition. And basically, like, you can kind of see it a lot through her song, right? Because Galbranna's song Aphelion, which is one of my like personal favorites still, by the way, it's a great song. There's like two very particular lyrics that are biblical references and I really like, which is like basically just, am I the lamb that must be slaughtered, so the sacrificial lamb that is used to cleanse people's sins? Or is she the evil with the knife that plunges into the lamb while it weeps. And the way that kind of like these lyrics and just Galbrenna's lore and story has been depicted seems to paint religion as a kind of hypocrisy. But when you, for example, read like a lot of like theological like treatises and like discussions, you kind of notice that these kinds of questions have been, you know, like asked by theologians for centuries, right? And that's why, like, for example, when I was reading through like St. Augustine's like The City of God, which is basically kind of like a group of letters that St. Augustine, who was like a Christian religious leader, wrote to a lot of his detractors when the Western Roman Empire fell, right? He says, for example, like presents this idea that sin must be voluntary, right? You cannot be a sinner if you do not want to be a sinner, right? Like, it needs to either be voluntary or originate from a source or an act that was voluntary, right? And he kind of like talks about, for example, how in the first book, he presents this kind of like case study of like basically the virgin priestesses who were raped by the barbarians who were sacking Rome, right? And basically he was like making this argument that like they can't be sinners because they're even though kind of like they were like, you know, like, oh, no longer pristine or whatever, right? The fact that what happened to them was not voluntary means that they themselves cannot be sinners, right? And he had this quote, it was like, you know, nothing that another person does in the body or upon the body is any fault of the person who suffers it, as so long as he cannot escape it without sin. So basically, if someone doesn't have agency, then they sin like inadvertently, then it's not really their fault. They can't be considered a sinner in the eyes of like St. Augustine, right? So there is a lot of nuance to, for example, a character like Galbrenna. Like, as I said before, Galbrenna's song is like one of my favorites still because it's something that has so many layers to it, right? And you probably know, like, that's my favorite kind of thing. When it comes down to, for example, not just how she is both a sinner but also a good character, but also how it seems like she's like this kind of like anti like, you know, like atheistic kind of character, but like at the same time it's not, right? It's more so like it's just religiously nuanced. And that's why, like, for example, when you go back to the Exorcist Rider, it's the exact same case as all of these kind of like humanist perspectives on religion that Kuro has been kind of like taking, right? Because the Exorcist Rider, as this kind of like unwilling god, just like regardless of kind of like the differences of like, you know, the Frostland and the desert between the two types of Lahai-Rois, this difference between the original narrative of Lahai-Roi, like God visiting the Egyptian maidservant Hagar, and then the Exorcist Rider being an unwilling god providing salvation and hope to an equally desperate group of people, is a very humanist way of looking and reinterpreting a kind of like biblical event, right? And it's this kind of idea that basically, you know, as we know before, the Exorcist Rider is not a god. He was never meant to be a god, but he went above and beyond to provide hope and salvation regardless. Like, he gave his heart to become the son, and that's why we know, for example, the Royans call him Balder. Balder being the Norse god of light. So at the end of the day, like, when you kind of think about what Lahai-Roi as a concept really means, it's really just another kind of like tick to this constant message that we've been getting about what Wuthering Waves' message really is, right? It's this idea that the relentless march of humanity progresses despite this kind of impossible fate imposed upon them, right? Because at the end of the day, within Lahai-Roi, a land that never received a sentinel, the salvation that they received was a being that themselves knew they were not a god, right? But that being, the Exorcist Rider, shared their ethos that humanity can keep on persevering on, and that's why the Exorcist Rider sacrificed itself, provided its heart, and made sure that Lahai-Roi could live, right? And when you combine that with a lot of like the other scenes in 3.3, such as the Explorers cutscene you see over here, where humanity like pushes on against this impossible future, then everything when you put it together makes a lot of sense, right? It's going towards this central message at the end of the day. So the TLD of the video is that basically Lahai-Roi, the true meaning of it, if you want to take it simply, is just more humanity glazing. So that's basically it, right? If you guys have any thoughts, more than happy to kind of like have you guys discuss in the comments. But yeah, that should sorry, I'm a bit sick as well still. But that should be basically the end of the video. So if you enjoy kind of like these PowerPoint presentations, make sure to let me know. But besides that, you can support me through subscribing, donating, or even becoming a channel member. But other than that, hopefully you guys have a good rest of the day, and I'll see you guys in the next one.